Welcome to the Remedify coaching program. Your health is your wealth. When we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this built-in expectation of precision.
Right. It feels very mechanical, very certain.
Exactly. Like you break your arm, right?
Yeah.
The X-ray produces this high-contrast image showing a jagged white line, and the physician just points to it. There's no debate about what you're looking
Yeah,
at.
it is entirely visible. I mean, the fracture either exists in the bone or it doesn't.
Right.
The parameters for determining the truth of the situation are completely agreed upon before the patient even walks into the room.
But the moment you step into the world of ancient texts, historical timelines, and centuries-old theological arguments, that high-contrast X-ray machine just kind of shatters.
It really does.
We're suddenly navigating a landscape that requires a completely different set of tools. We're looking at how texts converse with each other across centuries, how they borrow authority from one another, and, well, how they attempt to construct or deconstruct entire worldviews.
Which is a massive undertaking.
It is. And that brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive for you, our listener. Whether you're fascinated by history, theology, or you just love dissecting a really well-constructed logical argument, this dive is going to give you a major aha moment about how religious texts are structurally debated.
I think so, too.
We're exploring a fascinating document today titled, "If in Doubt, Ask the People of the Book." And this text, it falls under the category of modern apologetics.
Let us actually define that term for you, the listener, before we go any further. Because apologetics, it doesn't mean apologizing.
Right, it's not saying I'm sorry.
Not at all. It comes from the Greek word apologia, which basically means speaking in defense of a position or offering a reasoned argument. So in a theological context, it is the intellectual defense of a specific faith system.
Yeah, and the document we're analyzing today constructs this highly specific, almost mathematically precise deductive argument regarding the relationship between Christian and Islamic scriptures.
Which requires us to lay down some firm ground rules for how we are going to approach this material with you today.
Absolutely. We need to be clear about this.
Our objective here is strictly an exercise in textual and logical analysis. We are mapping out the author's methodology. We want to understand how they construct their argument, how they define their terms, and how they attempt to connect their initial premise to their final conclusion.
Exactly. We are not taking a theological side here.
No, we are not evaluating the spiritual truth of either faith tradition, nor are we endorsing the theological conclusions reached by the author of this document.
Right, we're acting as impartial observers. We are merely examining the structural mechanics of the argument presented in the text itself.
And that structural analysis is what makes this document such an interesting case study, frankly. The author makes a very calculated rhetorical choice right at the beginning.
How so? Like, where do they start?
Well, in many debates, especially those concerning deeply held religious beliefs, there's this tendency to start from a position of total alienation.
Oh, just immediately attacking the opponent's foundational texts.
Exactly, just tearing it down from word one. But this author takes the exact opposite approach. They attempt to establish a patch of common ground by looking at what the Quran itself says about Christians and Jews.
Who are referred to historically within the Islamic tradition as the people of the book. Right?
Yes, that's the specific historical categorization.
I want to dig into that historical context for a moment, because when a 7th century text refers to the people of the book, it's creating a very deliberate framework. The author of our source document points to Surah 10.94.
And what does that verse say?
It reads, "If you are in doubt about these stories that we have revealed to you, then ask those who read the scripture before you."
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, that instruction to actively seek out the readers of older scriptures to resolve contemporary doubt, that is basically the linchpin of the author's entire argument.
That's a huge starting point, and the author actually pairs that instruction with Surah 29.46.
Okay, what's the connection there?
This passage instructs Muslims not to argue with the people of the book unless it is done gracefully. And it goes even further, stating, "We believe in what has been revealed to us and what was revealed to you. Our God and your God is only one."
So by isolating these specific verses, the author is deliberately highlighting a mechanism of textual respect that's literally built into the newer document.
Precisely. It's a very clever way of establishing that shared textual foundation.
It's an attempt to borrow authority. To use a literary analogy here, think about how a modern author might write a sequel to, say, a beloved 19th century classic novel.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Right. So the original novel has an established fan base. It already has credibility.
A built-in audience, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. For the sequel to be accepted by that existing audience, the new author can't just completely rewrite the history of the original universe.
No, they'd alienate everyone immediately.
Right. The new book has to constantly reference the original, validating its events and adhering to its established rules. Basically, the sequel relies on the pre-existing authority of the older text to justify its own presence in the literary canon.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. The author of our document is identifying a very similar dynamic playing out in the 7th century.
How do they show that?
They point out that the Quran is positioning itself not as a completely separate novel revelation, but as a continuation, a confirmation of older established texts.
Right, they cite Surah 3.3 to reinforce this, don't they?
Yes. This verse states that the book was revealed in truth, quote, confirming what came before it as he revealed the Torah and the Gospel.
Let me pause and just look at the rhetorical strategy happening here, because it's fascinating. The author is using what philosophers call an internal critique.
Right, working from the inside out.
Exactly. Instead of imposing an outside standard like, say, modern secular historical methods onto the text, the author is actually stepping inside the worldview of the text they're analyzing.
They are essentially saying, I am going to use your own stated rules and definitions to evaluate your claims.
Which is the very function of an internal critique. So premise one of the author's argument is established here. The Quran explicitly acknowledges the Torah and the Gospel as divine revelations.
And premise 2, the Quran explicitly instructs its followers to consult the readers of those earlier scriptures if they experience doubt.
So by starting here, the author builds this logical foundation based on the premise that both faiths, according to the Islamic texts themselves, originally shared a recognized textual foundation.
They did, but, the author doesn't stay on that common ground for very long.
No, they don't. Once they establish that the Quran confirms the Torah and the Gospel, they pivot sharply to address a major modern controversy.
The accusation of textual corruption.
Yes. The common argument encountered in these modern debates is that the Bible might have been a divine revelation originally, but over the centuries it was altered or mistranslated or deliberately corrupted by human hands.
Right. And the author anticipates this exact accusation. They use the source material itself to construct a counter-argument.
How do they do that?
They draw attention to Surah 5.68, which addresses the people of the book directly. It states, you have nothing to stand on unless you observe the Torah, the Gospel, and what has been revealed to you from your Lord.
Okay, wait, I need to challenge the author's timeline here on behalf of you, the listener, because this is the first thing that jumps out to me.
Go for it.
If the author is pointing out that Christians were being commanded to observe the Gospel in the 7th century, which is when the Quran was being compiled, does the document address the possibility that the text might have already been corrupted by that point in history?
I see what you're getting at.
I mean, is it possible from a historical perspective that the 7th century audience was being told to observe a text that had slowly drifted from its original meaning over hundreds of years without anyone even realizing it?
That is a very fair vulnerability to point out in the timeline. And it is precisely what the author is attempting to seal up in the next phase of their argument.
Okay, so they do address it.
They do. To counter this, they introduce Surah 5.46 and 5.47. Verse 46 states that Jesus was given the gospel containing guidance and light, confirming the Torah.
Okay.
But the author leans incredibly heavily on the phrasing of verse 47. It commands, so let the people of the gospel judge by what Allah has revealed in it, and those who do not judge by what Allah has revealed are truly the rebellious.
Let the people of the gospel judge by what Allah has revealed in it.
Wow!
Okay, so the author is treating that command as a real-time instruction given to a 7th century audience.
Yes. Furthermore, the author combines that real-time command with the theological statements made in Surah 6.114 and 6.115.
What do those say?
Verse 115 is the really critical component. It states, the word of your Lord has been perfected in truth and justice. None can change his words.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. This is where the author begins to assemble a formal syllogism.
Let's clearly define what a syllogism is for you listening, just so we're all on the same page. A syllogism is a form of deductive reasoning, where you arrive at a specific conclusion by examining two other premises that are asserted to be true.
The classic philosophical example being,
Right, the Socrates one. All humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. If those first two statements are true, the conclusion is inescapable. It's locked in.
and the author is constructing a very similar deductive sequence here. Let us examine the premises they are putting forward.
Okay, lay them out.
Premise A. The Quran states that God's words cannot be changed by human hands. Premise B. The Quran identifies the Torah and the Gospel as the words of God. Premise C. The Quran commands Christians living in the 7th century to use the Gospel they currently possess as a standard of judgment.
So applying that deductive framework we just talked about, the author's logical conclusion is that the gospel must have been intact and fundamentally uncorrupted at the time of Muhammad.
Exactly. The author is arguing that asserting anything else violates the law of non-contradiction.
Hold on, let's unpack the law of non-contradiction really quick. In philosophy, this law simply states that two opposing statements cannot both be true at the exact same time and in the exact same sense.
It's an either-or scenario.
Right. To use a physical analogy, a light switch cannot be fundamentally wired in the off position while simultaneously conducting electricity to power a bulb. It just can't.
So, applying that philosophical law to the text, the author argues that a text cannot be unchangeable and simultaneously corrupted. They are mutually exclusive states of being.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, the author points out a functional paradox. If the text had been corrupted prior to the 7th century, the command in Surah 5.47 to judge by what Allah has revealed in it would logically equate to a divine command to use a corrupted, false document as a standard for truth.
Which would be nonsensical. But I have to ask, does the author address the nuance of what corruption actually meant to an ancient audience?
What do you mean?
Well, modern textual critics define corruption as the physical alteration of manuscripts, right?
Right.
Like copyist errors, added verses, or
Right,
weird paragraphs.
physical changes.
But in ancient theological disputes, corruption sometimes referred to the misinterpretation of the text rather than the physical alteration of the words themselves. Like, you have the right words, but you're corrupting the meaning. Does the document make that distinction?
That is a great distinction to make. The document operates strictly within the parameters of physical and fundamental textual alteration. The author's argument is laser-focused on the physical reliability of the Torah and the Gospel as documents.
Got it.
They argue that a divine prophet cannot logically command followers to utilize a physically or fundamentally corrupted document as a moral or theological compass. Therefore, according to the author's deduction, the text could not have been physically corrupted.
Before we get to the author's explosive conclusion, we want to invite you to visit our podcast series, Remedify Coaching Program, for more exciting episodes.
Also, do not forget to check the episode description for more resources that can help you grow in your spirit, mind, and body. Also, do not forget to start your free Bible training at Tyrannus Hall Bible College, THBC, by visiting the link in the description, https://shop.beacons.aak2020 Tyrannus Hall Bible College.
So as we examine the philosophical ultimatum the author lays out in the conclusion section of their document, we really see how these initial premises are synthesized.
It all comes together here.
Yeah. The author claims that if the Torah and the Gospel are true revelations from God, as confirmed by those earlier verses they cited, then the followers of the newer text are logically obligated to use the older texts to judge the newer one.
Which is a significant rhetorical pivot. The author takes the instruction originally intended for the people of the book to judge by the gospel and applies it universally to everyone.
They construct a final if A, then B scenario. They argue that if the Quran does not align with or confirm the fundamental events and teachings proclaimed in the Torah and the Gospel, then the newer text cannot be logically sustained as a continuation of that same divine source.
Returning to your earlier analogy about the book sequel, it is the equivalent of a literary critic arguing that if a sequel fundamentally violates the immutable laws of physics established in the original book, while simultaneously claiming the original book is absolute truth.
The sequel invalidates its own authority.
Exactly. It contradicts the foundation it claims to stand on. That is the structural mechanism of the author's argument.
However, a deductive trap requires a trigger.
What do you mean by a trigger?
Well, a philosophical ultimatum only functions if there is a tangible, demonstrable conflict between the two subjects being compared. Like if the texts generally agree, the logic remains totally theoretical. The author needs a specific point of contradiction to actuate the argument.
And the author selects what is arguably the most significant historical and theological contradiction available. They focus on the event of the crucifixion.
Okay, this is where it gets really specific.
Very. The document cites Surah 4.157. Now, for the Christian tradition, the physical crucifixion and subsequent resurrection of Christ are the non-negotiable foundations of the faith.
Right. Without that, the rest of it falls apart.
But the author highlights how Surah 4.157 addresses this exact event. The text states that they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it was made to appear so to them.
Wow, okay. That's a direct denial.
It further states that those who differ on this are full of doubts, making assumptions, and they certainly did not kill him.
So at this point in the document, the author is basically springing the logical trap.
Exactly. You have the Gospel, which the author argues was affirmed by the Quran as a standard of judgment, explicitly detailing the crucifixion as a historical reality.
And conversely, you have the Quran explicitly denying that the event took place at all.
Under the law of non-contradiction, the author points out that both accounts cannot reflect historical reality. One must be incorrect.
This completely shifts the document's focus from internal philosophical critique to the realm of historical documentation. I mean, think about how historians evaluate competing claims about ancient events.
It's all about the sources.
Right. If you're trying to reconstruct a political assassination from antiquity, and you have two competing sources, you have to weigh their provenance.
How close were they to the event?
Exactly. If source A is a collection of diaries and letters written by eyewitnesses and politicians within, say, 20 years of the assassination, and source B is a manifesto written by someone living in a completely different hemisphere 600 years later, historians default to the primary source material. Every time.
Regardless of how confident that later author sounds.
Yes, exactly.
Well, the author of our document utilizes a very similar methodology regarding historical proximity. They introduce a timeline to demonstrate the gap between the events in question and the recording of those events.
Okay, let's hear the timeline.
The author notes that the four Gospels were composed in Greek. They provide dates, placing Mark around AD 66 to 70, Matthew and Luke around AD 85 to 90, and John between AD 90 and 110.
So by providing those specific dates, the author is clearly making a point about proximity to the event.
Very much so. The crucifixion is historically dated to roughly AD 30 or 33.
Right, so the author is emphasizing that the gospel accounts were composed within just a few decades of the event,
placing them well within the potential lifespan of eyewitnesses, or at the very least, immediate secondary sources.
which gives them significant historical weight.
Yes. And the author also expands the timeline backward to establish a broader paper trail for the biblical texts. They bring the Septuagint into the analysis.
Okay, let's explain that. For listeners who might be unfamiliar, what is the Septuagint?
The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. This translation effort actually began in Alexandria, Egypt, around 300 BC during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and was largely completed by 200 BC.
But wait, why does the author include the Septuagint in an argument specifically about the Gospel and the Quran?
They include it to establish the antiquity and verifiable existence of the broader biblical tradition centuries before the emergence of Christianity, let alone Islam.
Oh, I see.
By pointing to the Septuagint, the author demonstrates that the foundational texts of the Jewish tradition were already codified, translated, and disseminated throughout the Hellenized world hundreds of years before the first century.
So it establishes this massive, verifiable textual footprint. The author is essentially piling up documentary evidence. They're saying, here is a heavily documented tradition spanning from 300 BC straight through the late first century.
Exactly. And then they contrast that massive timeline with the arrival of the Quran,
which comes a lot later.
The author emphasizes the temporal gap. The Quran is compiled in the 7th century. The author calculates this as roughly 600 years after the composition of the Gospels.
And almost 800 years after the completion of the Septuagint translation.
It's a huge gap.
6 centuries is a profound span of time when you're dealing with historical memory. I mean, think about it. That's the distance between us today and the early 1400s.
And Middle Ages.
Right. It's an immense gap.
Yeah.
And the author uses this gap to introduce a specific phrase that basically serves as the thesis for this entire section.
Confidence does not equal competence.
Yes, that phrase is so crucial. Let's really analyze what they mean by that.
The author is addressing the psychological impact of textual authority. Surah 4.157 speaks with absolute, unyielding certainty. It declares that they certainly did not kill him and frames any opposing view as mere assumption.
But the author's phrase, confidence does not equal competence, argues that theological certainty in a 7th century text simply cannot retroactively overwrite the historical proximity of 1st century documents.
Right. The author is basically arguing that the tone of a document does not alter physical history.
Right. A text can claim absolute authority all at once, but if it is separated from an event by 600 years, it inherently lacks the historical competence of documents written within a generation of the event.
Regardless of how confidently the later claim is made.
Exactly.
So following the author's logical sequence, Because the texts contradict on a foundational teaching, they cannot both be factually true.
Because of the law of non-contradiction.
Exactly. And because the author believes they have established, using the Quran's own earlier verses regarding the preservation of God's words, that the gospel is the required standard of judgment.
They conclude that the text making the contradictory claim 6 centuries later is the one that ultimately fails the deductive test.
That is the conclusion they draw.
Now, the structure of the document up to this point is entirely analytical. It relies on syllogisms, timelines, and the parsing of specific verses.
Very academic.
But as we look at the final section of the text, there is a severe shift in the rhetorical strategy. I mean, the academic deconstruction just abruptly ends.
The tone and the format change completely. The author actually abandons the step-by-step argumentation they have used for the entirety of the document.
What do they do instead?
Instead, they conclude by simply presenting 3 specific Bible verses without any accompanying commentary or philosophical breakdown.
No breakdown at all.
None. The verses are John 14.6, Romans 10.9, and Romans 10.13.
Let us examine the content of those verses to understand why the author placed them at the very end of this intense intellectual exercise. The document cites John 14.6, which reads, Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.
That is a statement of absolute exclusivity.
It really is. The document then moves to Romans 10.9. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved.
And it concludes with Romans 10.13. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved.
So from a structural perspective, we really have to ask why the author selected these 3 specific passages out of thousands. I mean, why not end with a verse about historical reliability or maybe a proverb about wisdom, which might seem way more fitting for an academic argument?
It's a great question. And to understand the selection, we must look at the psychological arc the author has designed for the reader. Recall the very first phrase in the title of the document.
If in doubt.
Correct. The document was explicitly framed for a reader experiencing doubt. Someone caught in the tension between 2 competing worldviews.
Right.
The author then guided that reader through a methodical, rigid deconstruction of one of those worldviews, using its own internal logic against it.
They effectively dismantle the reader's previous ideological foundation piece by piece.
But rhetorically, you cannot simply dismantle a belief system and leave the reader in a void. If you systematically remove someone's theological certainty, you create a state of severe cognitive dissonance.
Oh, absolutely. It's destabilizing.
The author understands this psychological reality perfectly. The shift from academic deconstruction to these specific verses is an attempt to resolve that cognitive dissonance.
The document transitions from a critique to an invitation.
Exactly. The verses the author selects represent, within the Christian tradition, the ultimate statements of assurance and certainty.
It's a very calculated narrative progression. John 14.6 acts as a definitive truth claim to replace the dismantled claims of the previous text.
And Romans 10.9 and 10.13 offer a highly accessible mechanism for personal security, confess, and believe, and salvation is guaranteed.
It moves the reader from the exhausting process of historical doubt straight into a promise of absolute security.
There is also a subtle thematic tie-in that the author executes here, which is quite brilliant.
Oh.
By focusing on Romans 10.9, which explicitly requires the reader to believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, the author reinforces the specific historical contradiction they used to spring their logical trap earlier.
They are drawing a direct line between the event the 7th century text denied, the crucifixion and subsequent resurrection, and the mechanism for ultimate salvation in the 1st century text.
Yes. It demonstrates how deeply interconnected the author's strategy is from start to finish.
They aren't just throwing facts at a wall. They are meticulously managing the emotional and intellectual journey of the reader. They use history and logic to clear away the old structure, and then use theology to build a new landing pad.
It really highlights how these ancient documents are continuously weaponized and analyzed in modern contexts.
It absolutely does. And it leads us to a broader observation regarding the very nature of textual study.
It is remarkable how a single, specific instruction embedded in an ancient text, like the command in Surah 10.94 to ask those who read the scripture before you, can inadvertently become the fulcrum for centuries of intense theological debate.
Just a single sentence. It can serve as the hinge that swings massive philosophical doors.
It invites the listener to consider the interconnectedness of historical documents. It really raises the question of what other hidden threads, what other subtle dependencies exist between the foundational texts of various global traditions, just waiting to be analyzed through this kind of rigorous structural critique.
It completely changes how you view the relationships between ancient writers and the texts they leave behind. If you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to visit our podcast series, Remedify Coaching Program, for more exciting episodes.
And remember to check the episode description for more resources that can help you grow in your spirit, mind, and body. Also, do not forget to start your free Bible training at Tyrannus Hall Bible College, THBC, at the link in our description.
Thank you for visiting the Remedify Coaching Program. We trust your time was well spent with us today. Bye for now. Always remember, your health is your responsibility.